Whatever is the outcome of today's state elections, when the final figures go up, the vigorous campaigning of the Australian Labour Party will bear the strong imprint of Mr Fancis Henry Walsh. A former stonemason who went to the polls today as the leader of the opposition, Mr Walsh has been a member of the House of Assembly for 21 years. Here he's surrounded by some of the men who could be future cabinet ministers. Mr Walsh was elected in 1941 as the member for Goodwood. The electorate's name was changed to Edwardstown in 1953. Mr Walsh became leader of Her Majesty's opposition in South Australia in October 1960, succeeding the late Mr M.R. O'Halloran. Before this, he had been deputy leader for 11.5 years. Before his appointment as opposition leader, Mr Walsh served on many parliamentary committees. At present, he's still a member of the Joint House Committee and the Standing Orders Committee. A member of the ALP for some 40 years, Mr Walsh has also retained his close association with the industrial wing of the party. He is state and federal president of the operative Stonemason Society. As leader of the opposition, Mr Walsh spends much time in his basement office at Parliament House, attending to matters ranging from a small problem of a constituent in the Edwardstown electorate to framing Labour's policy on legislation proposed by the government. In Parliament, Mr Walsh has led many attacks on the government. He has put forward proposals which the government has embodied in its own legislation. His long political experience enables him quickly to grasp the implications of any legislation which comes before the House and to debate it forcefully. His hold on the leadership of the Parliamentary Labour Party is strong, and opposition members have given him loyal support. During his service as leader, there has never been as much as a hint of a split or diversion of opinion in the party. The industrial wing also has given him solid support. Ability and personal popularity have been Mr Walsh's main attributes in keeping his party together. In the last few weeks, Mr Walsh has spent many hours a day in his office preparing Labour's policy for today's election and planning the party's campaign. It was his first election as leader, but behind him was a wealth of experience gained in both the political and industrial spheres of the ALP, and invaluable help from party officers and his own staff. The office part of the day over, Mr Walsh heads for home, with still a busy time ahead of him. He prefers to drive himself in his own vehicle, although, as leader of the opposition, he's entitled to a government-chauffeured car. Mr Walsh lives in a modest home in the suburb of Black Forest in his electorate. The Edwardstown electorate is heavily industrialised, but it also contains some middle-class sections. There are about 30,000 people on the rolls, and in all elections, Mr Walsh has been returned with a comfortable majority. Mr Walsh is aged 64. He and Mrs Walsh have two grown-up sons, both married. South Australian by birth, Mr Walsh attended state schools and the Christian Brothers College. His education at a church college has been reflected in his public duties, and in his addresses in Parliament there have been many references by him to Christian ideals. Mr Walsh has been denied the enjoyment of hobbies because of a busy political life, but he retains his fondness for gardening, and it's in the garden that he can usually be found in his limited spare time. His wife says his life seems to be one of parliamentary duties and meetings. Mr Walsh made no lavish promises in his policy speech, in which he asked the people of South Australia to vote Labour into office after it spent nearly 30 years on the opposition benches. He outlined plans to stimulate employment, economic recovery and development of the state's resources. Mr Walsh also promised industrial reform, the creation of a housing ministry, standardization of the state's railway system, the setting up of a hire purchase department, reorganization of the 2 state-owned banking institutions, the establishment of a commission to inquire into restrictive trade practices, and greater provision of pensioner cottages. Observers say that an early decision of a Labour government would be to act on what Labour people call the electoral gerrymander, and introduce industrial legislation particularly relating to the restoration of basic wage adjustments. It's 29 years since Labour occupied the government benches in South Australia. The last Labour government was in 1930-33. There were 2 premiers in that parliament, Lionel Hill and R.S. Richards. Mr Richards held office for 64 days. Then the long reign of the LCL began, with Sir Thomas Playford in office from 1938 until the present time, a record for any premier in the Commonwealth. Mr Fancis Henry Walsh, who began his career as a stonemason. Tonight, as leader of the opposition, he's waiting for the final votes to be counted to learn the verdict of the people of South Australia.